The dust of Jerusalem has a memory. It holds the footprints of prophets, the blood of sacrifices, and on this particular morning, it was about to hold a secret that would echo through eternity. Before we step into the dusty streets of Jerusalem to witness this miracle, may the Almighty God protect and bring abundance to those who subscribe and like this content for our efforts. It might seem simple to you, but it brings us great joy. Plus, please mention in the comments which part of the world you are watching from, as responding to your thoughts truly delights us. Now, let us return to the shadow of the temple walls, where a trap was being set not just for a sinner, but for the Savior himself. The sun had barely crested over the Mount of Olives, casting long, pale shadows across the limestone courtyards of the temple. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of burning incense from the morning sacrifice and the stale odor of unwashed bodies from the pilgrim crowds. For most, it was a time of prayer, a time to seek the face of Yahweh. But for a select group of scribes and Pharisees, this morning was not dedicated to prayer, but to a hunt. They moved with a predatory urgency, their robes swishing against the stone pavement like the hiss of vipers. They were not looking for God, they were looking for an execution. And they needed a pawn. In a small, dimly lit room in the lower city, far from the sanctity of the temple, terror had a name. She was dragged from the bed, the sheets still tangled around her legs, the smell of illicit passion suddenly replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of fear. There was no time to dress properly, no time to cover her shame. Rough hands, hands that claimed to hold the law of Moses, gripped her arms with bruising force. She wasn't a person to them, she was a weapon. They didn't look at her with lust, nor even with the righteous anger they feigned. They looked at her with cold calculation. She was the bait for a trap set for the rabbi from Nazareth. Move. One of the Pharisees barked, shoving her forward. She stumbled, her bare feet scraping against the unforgiving cobblestones. The man she had been with was gone, vanished into the shadows, conveniently ignored by the religious police. It was a glaring injustice that screamed of a setup, but in her position, silence was the only defense, though it offered no shield against the stones she knew were coming. As they dragged her through the winding streets, the city was waking up. Shopkeepers unrolling their awnings stopped to stare. Women carrying water jars averted their eyes, clutching their children closer. The public shame was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Tears streamed down her face, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks, but her captors were relentless. They marched with a terrifying purpose, their faces set like flint. They were heading to the treasury, to the very heart of the temple courts, where they knew he would be. Jesus was there, as he always was, seated near the treasury boxes. A crowd had gathered around him, simple people, fishermen, widows, farmers, hanging on his every word. He spoke of a kingdom not made of bricks and mortar, but of spirit and truth. His voice was a calm current in the chaotic sea of Jerusalem. But that peace was about to be shattered. The commotion arrived before the men did. The sound of shouting, the scuffle of sandals, and the weeping of the woman pierced the morning air. The crowd around Jesus parted, confusion rippling through them like a wave. The scribes and Pharisees burst into the circle, their breathing heavy, their eyes wild with a triumphant malice. They hurled the woman into the center of the gathering. She fell hard, collapsing in a heap of trembling limbs and disheveled hair at the feet of the carpenter. Silence fell. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. The dust settled around her, coating her skin, mixing with her sweat and tears. She dared not look up. She saw only the hem of a simple robe and the sandaled feet of the man standing before her. She waited for the first kick, the first curse, the first stone, but the man above her did not move. He did not recoil in disgust. One of the Pharisees, a tall man with a beard grayed by years of studying the law, stepped forward. He held a stone in his hand, not a pebble, but a jagged rock, heavy enough to crush bone. He looked at the crowd, ensuring he had an audience, and then he turned his gaze to Jesus. This was the moment. The trap was sprung. "Teacher," he spat the word out with a veneer of respectful mockery. This woman was caught in the act of adultery. He paused, letting the accusation hang in the air. The crowd gasped. Adultery. It was a capital offense. It was a breach of the covenant, a stain on the community. In the very act, another scribe added, emphasizing the undeniable nature of her sin. There was no need for a trial, no need for witnesses. They claimed to have seen it all. The hypocrisy of their presence in her bedroom was lost on no one, yet the law was the law. The lead Pharisee continued, his voice rising so that everyone in the courtyard could hear the dilemma he was about to present. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such women. He weighed the rock in his hand, the sound of skin against stone scratching the silence. Now, what do you say? The trap was perfect. It was a masterclass in theological and political entrapment. If Jesus said, "Let her go," he would be defying the law of Moses. He would be branded a heretic, a false prophet who encouraged sin and disregarded the commandments of God. The people would turn on him, and the Sanhedrin would have the grounds to arrest him for blasphemy. But if he said, "Stone her," he would be breaking Roman law. The Romans had stripped the Jewish courts of the right to enforce capital punishment. Only the Roman governor could sign a death warrant. If Jesus ordered her death, the Pharisees could run to Pontius Pilate and accuse Jesus of sedition, of usurping Roman authority. Furthermore, he would lose the common people who loved him for his mercy and compassion. It was a checkmate. Death or disobedience, treason or heresy. The woman squeezed her eyes shut, her body bracing for the impact. She knew the law. She knew the penalty. She could feel the hatred radiating from the men who surrounded her, a wall of self-righteous fury. She was nothing to them but a symbol of filth. She waited for the rabbi to speak the word that would end her life. But Jesus did not speak. Instead, he did something that confused them all. He moved, but not towards the woman, and not towards the accusers. He bent down. The crowd watched, bewildered. Was he avoiding the question? Was he afraid? The teacher stooped low, his knees brushing the dusty pavement. He extended a finger that had shaped galaxies, a finger that had touched lepers and made them clean, and he began to trace patterns in the dust. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. The Pharisees exchanged glances. This wasn't the reaction they expected. They wanted a debate. They wanted a fight. They wanted a yes or a no. They did not expect this strange, quiet act of writing in the dirt. "Teacher." The Pharisee barked again, impatience leaking into his voice. "We asked you a question. Moses commands she die. What is your verdict?" Jesus continued to write. The grit of the earth moved under his fingernail. He seemed completely absorbed in the task, ignoring the venom in their voices, ignoring the lethal rocks in their hands. It was as if he was in a different world, a world where their hatred held no power. The tension in the courtyard tightened like a bowstring about to snap. The crowd leaned in, craning their necks. What was he doing? What was he waiting for? The woman, shivering on the ground, opened one eye. She saw his hand moving rhythmically on the stone floor. She didn't understand. Why wasn't he condemning her? Why wasn't he saving himself? The accusers pressed in closer, invading his personal space, looming over his bent form. They badgered him, repeating the question, demanding an answer, certain that his silence was an admission of defeat. They thought they had him cornered. They thought the Lion of Judah had been tamed by a legal technicality. But they had forgotten who wrote the law in the first place. Suddenly, the movement of his hand stopped. The dust settled. Jesus froze, his finger resting on the ground. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric authority that made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Slowly, deliberately, he rose. He didn't stand like a cornered animal. He stood like a king. He straightened to his full height, brushing the dust from his hands. He looked at the lead Pharisee, then scanned the faces of the mob, looking directly into their eyes, eyes that burned with murder. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He didn't quote a counter-scripture. He spoke with a voice that was terrifyingly calm, a voice that sounded like Judgment Day itself. "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." The words hung in the air, simple, yet devastating. He hadn't rejected the law of Moses. He had upheld it, but he had raised the standard to an impossible height. He hadn't incited rebellion against Rome. He hadn't ordered an execution. He had turned the courtroom inside out. He had put the judges on trial, and then, just as quickly as he had risen, he stooped down again. He turned his back on them, exposing his neck to their stones, an act of supreme confidence. He returned to the dust, his finger finding the earth once more, and this is where the mystery truly began. Because this time, as he wrote, the Pharisees didn't shout. They didn't demand an answer. They looked at the ground. They looked at what he was writing. The first word appeared in the dust, legible and clear in the morning light. The lead Pharisee, the one with the largest stone, looked down. His eyes widened. The blood drained from his face. His grip on the rock loosened. What Jesus wrote next would shatter their self-righteousness more effectively than any argument. It was a secret written in sand, destined to be blown away by the wind, but in that moment, it was etched into their souls with fire. The finger moved with agonizing slowness, dragging through the fine, gray silk that covered the limestone. The oldest Pharisee, the one who had been so eager to cast the first stone, felt his breath hitch in his throat. He squinted against the glare of the morning sun, trying to decipher the Hebrew characters forming in the dirt. He expected a scripture, perhaps a citation from Leviticus or Deuteronomy, something he could argue against, something he could twist with his superior knowledge of the Torah. But Jesus was not writing scripture. The first word was a name. Miriam. The old man's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. It was a common name, he told himself. There were thousands of Miriams in Judea. But then, the finger continued, tracing a location next to the name. The house of figs, Bethany. And finally, a date from 40 years ago. The stone in the old man's hand suddenly felt as heavy as a mountain. The blood drained from his face, leaving him pale and trembling. 40 years ago, he had been a young man, full of passion and hidden vices. He had taken advantage of a servant girl in a storehouse in Bethany, a girl named Miriam. He had paid her for her silence, and she had disappeared. He had buried that memory so deep he thought even God had forgotten it. He had built a lifetime of piety, of long prayers and public fasting, on top of that grave. He was a pillar of the community now, a judge of others' morality. But the man crouching in the dust knew. Jesus did not look up. He did not need to. He simply smoothed over the dust with the palm of his hand, erasing the accusation as quickly as he had written it, and moved his finger a few inches to the right. He began to write again. The old man stumbled back, his knees weak. The self-righteous fire that had burned in his eyes was extinguished, replaced by a cold, hollow dread. He looked at Jesus, this carpenter from Nazareth who had never studied in their prestigious schools, and he saw not a heretic, but a mirror. A mirror that reflected the rot beneath the whitewashed tomb of his life. He couldn't breathe. The air in the courtyard felt thin. If he threw the stone now, he knew, with a terrifying certainty, that the earth would open up and swallow him whole. His fingers lost their strength. The jagged rock slipped from his grip. It hit the pavement with a dull, hollow thud. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the silent courtyard. The old man didn't say a word. He couldn't. He turned, wrapping his robes tightly around himself as if trying to hide his very soul, and walked away. He didn't walk with the proud, confident stride with which he had entered. He shuffled, his head bowed, an old man crushed by the weight of his own history revealed in the dust. The younger Pharisees and scribes were confused. Why was the elder leaving? He was their leader, the most learned among them. Rabbi? One of the younger zealots whispered, but the old man didn't look back. He vanished into the shadows of the colonnade. Now, the second oldest stepped forward. He was a man known for his strict adherence to the Sabbath laws, a man who would not walk an extra step on the holy day. He peered down at the dust, arrogant and confused, ready to demand an explanation for the elder's departure. Jesus was writing again. The widow's field. The man froze. He stared at the letters, blinking rapidly. Last winter, he had used a legal loophole to seize a small plot of land from a widow who owed a debt to the temple treasury, a debt he had artificially inflated. He had evicted her, claiming it was God's will, claiming it was for the benefit of the sanctuary. Everyone had praised him for his diligence in collecting temple dues. Jesus continued writing. Stolen. The word burned him. It wasn't a complex theological argument about jurisdiction. It was a direct arrow into his conscience. The face of the weeping widow flashed in his mind, superimposed over the bent back of the Messiah. He realized then that this man was not guessing. This was not a trick. This was a dissection. Jesus was peeling back the layers of their religious costumes to expose the naked, shivering greed underneath. The second stone fell. Thud. A ripple of unease turned into a wave of panic among the accusers. They began to realize what was happening. This was not a trial of the woman anymore. The courtroom had flipped. The judge was not the one standing with the rock. The judge was the one writing in the dirt. One by one, they stepped forward, drawn by a morbid curiosity and a desperate hope that their secrets were safe. And one by one, they were broken. For the wealthy merchant who secretly used false weights in the market, Jesus wrote asterisk. The scale. Asterisk. For the man who secretly hated his brother and cursed him in his heart, Jesus wrote asterisk. Cain. Asterisk. For the young, zealous student who visited the Roman brothels under the cover of darkness while preaching purity by day, Jesus simply wrote asterisk. The red door. Asterisk. The sound of falling stones became a rhythmic cadence in the courtyard. Clack, thud, clatter. It was the sound of judgment being dismantled, piece by piece. It was the sound of pride surrendering to truth. The mob, which had been a single, terrifying organism of hate just moments ago, was disintegrating. The unity of their anger was shattered by the isolation of their individual guilt. They couldn't look at each other. How could they? To look at their neighbor was to wonder what Jesus had written for them. They couldn't look at the woman, for her sin was now no different than theirs. Only hers was public, while theirs had been private until this terrifying morning. And they certainly couldn't look at Jesus. To look at him was to be seen, fully and completely, in a way that was unbearable for those who lived behind masks. The crowd thinned. The shuffling of sandals retreating across the stone floor replaced the shouting. The younger ones, seeing the elders, the guardians of the tradition, retreating in shame, lost their nerve. They didn't even wait to read their own indictments. The fear of exposure was enough. If the holiest men among them were dropping their stones, who were they to stand? The dust settled. The sun climbed higher, illuminating a scene that had changed dramatically. The circle of accusers was gone. The wall of hatred had crumbled, leaving behind only the debris of their failed execution, a scattering of jagged rocks lying harmlessly on the pavement. Jesus stopped writing. He wiped his hand on his robe, cleaning off the dust that now held the confession of an entire generation of leaders. He remained crouched for a moment longer, the silence of the courtyard heavy and profound. It wasn't the silence of tension anymore, it was the silence of aftermath. The storm had not broken, it had been dissolved. Finally, the movement ceased. The courtyard was empty, save for two people. One was the sinless one, the only person in the entire world who actually had the right to pick up one of those stones and throw it. He had the moral authority. He had the legal standing as the Son of God. He had every right to execute judgment. The other was the woman. She was still curled in a ball, her face pressed against the dirty stones, eyes squeezed shut. She had heard the thuds. She had heard the footsteps walking away. But she didn't trust it. She was waiting for the trick. She was waiting for the blow. She was trembling, not just from fear of death, but from the overwhelming, confusing reality that the death she deserved hadn't come. She waited for the voice of the accuser. But the only sound was the wind sweeping through the colonnades, gently disturbing the dust where her secrets, and the secrets of her judges, lay written together. The silence that descended upon the court of women was not merely the absence of noise. It was a physical weight, a tangible entity that pressed against the limestone pillars and settled like a heavy blanket over the scene of the aborted execution. It was the deafening roar of a storm that had suddenly, inexplicably, vanished into the ether. For the woman huddled on the ground, this silence was more terrifying than the shouting had been. The shouting was familiar. It was the soundtrack of her life, the chaotic noise of judgment, of bargaining, of violent passion and violent rejection. She understood the language of anger. She knew how to brace herself against a blow. But she did not know what to do with this emptiness. She lay curled in a fetal position, her knees pulled tight against her chest, her arms wrapping her head in a futile attempt to shield herself from the impact that never came. Her breath hitched in her throat, jagged and shallow, scraping against the raw dryness of her panic. She squeezed her eyelids shut so tightly that stars exploded in the darkness of her vision, phantoms of light dancing in the void. She listened. She strained every nerve, every fiber of her being, waiting for the asterisk whoosh of air that would signal a flying stone, the dull thud of rock against flesh, the explosion of pain that would end her misery. She waited for the coup de grace, the final condemnation from the rabbi. 1 second passed. Then 5, then 10. The only sound was the wind, a dry, desert breeze that whistled softly through the colonnades of the temple, rattling the dry leaves of a nearby palm and whispering secrets to the ancient stones. Somewhere in the distance, The bleating of a sacrificial sheep echoed, a reminder of the blood that was spilled daily in this place for the forgiveness of sins. Sins that usually required a price she could not pay. Slowly, the paralysis of terror began to crack, replaced by a confusion so profound it made her dizzy. Why was she still breathing? Why was her heart still beating, thumping against the cold stone floor like a trapped bird? She felt the grit of the pavement against her cheek, the sharp bite of a pebble digging into her hip. These were sensations of the living, not the dead. She heard the rustle of fabric. It was close, intimate. It was not the aggressive swish of the Pharisees' heavy robes, stiff with self-importance and religious ornamentation. It was the soft, rhythmic sound of simple linen moving against skin. Jesus was moving. The woman flinched, her muscles locking up again. This was it. He had waited for the others to leave so he could do it himself. He was the holiest of them all, wasn't he? The prophet from Galilee, the miracle worker. If anyone had the right to judge her filth, it was the man who had supposedly never known sin. Perhaps he didn't need a stone. Perhaps a word from him would be enough to stop her heart, but the blow did not come. Instead, the presence beside her shifted. The shadow that had fallen over her, cast by his standing form, changed shape. He was no longer towering over her. He was sinking down, or perhaps he was standing up from his crouch. She couldn't tell. Woman. The word hung in the air, suspended in the morning light. It was not shouted. It was not spat out like a curse. It didn't carry the dripping venom of the word adulteress or whore, titles she had worn like a second skin for as long as she could remember. It was a simple address, yet in his mouth, it carried a dignity she had forfeited years ago. It was the title given to Eve in the garden. It was the title of a mother, a sister, a daughter of Abraham. It was a restoration of humanity in 2 syllables. Woman, where are they? The question was soft, curious, almost as if he were asking about the weather or the time of day, rather than the whereabouts of a lynch mob that had intended to crush her skull. The absurdity of the question forced her to open her eyes. The light was blinding at first, stinging her tear-swollen pupils. She blinked rapidly, her vision swimming. The first thing she saw was the dust. The dust where he had written. The wind was already beginning to do its work, blurring the edges of the letters, sweeping away the catalog of sins that had saved her life. The words asterisk, Miriam, asterisk, asterisk, the scale, asterisk, asterisk, the red door, asterisk were fading, returning to the anonymity of the earth. She pushed herself up, her limbs trembling uncontrollably. Her hands shook as she brushed the hair from her face, hair that was disheveled, uncovered, a public disgrace in itself. She looked around, her head swiveling in jerky, frightened motions. The courtyard was vast. And it was empty. The sunlight stretched across the pavement, golden and indifferent. The heavy stones that had been dropped lay scattered in a rough semicircle around them, a monument to a battle that had been fought and won without a single sword being drawn. But the men? The gray-bearded judges? The young zealots with fire in their eyes? Gone, vanished like smoke. She looked up, and for the first time, she looked fully into the face of Jesus. He was standing now. He was tall, not in the way of a giant, but in the way of a mountain, immovable, grounded, eternal. His robe was dusty at the hem. His hands, the hands that had carved the names of hypocrites into the floor, hung relaxed at his sides. But it was his eyes that unmade her. She had known the eyes of men. She knew the hungry, predatory glint of lust that saw her as a piece of meat to be consumed. She knew the cold, dead stare of judgment that saw her as a cancer to be excised. She knew the averted gaze of shame. But she had never, not once in her fractured life, seen eyes like this. They were dark, the color of deep earth, but they held a light that seemed to originate from somewhere beyond the sun. They were eyes that saw everything, every lie she had ever told, every bed she had ever warmed, every tear she had ever swallowed, and yet, they did not recoil. There was no disgust, there was no surprise, there was only a calm, terrifyingly deep ocean of understanding. He saw the little girl she used to be, the broken woman she was, and the creature she was meant to become, all at once. Has no one condemned you? He asked. His voice broke the spell of her shock. She looked around one last time, needing to be sure. She checked the shadows of the pillars, half expecting a scribe to be lurking there with a rock in hand, waiting for a signal. But there was no one. The accusers had been stripped of their moral authority by their own consciences, awakened by the finger of God in the dirt. They could not condemn her without condemning themselves, and their pride would not allow them to stand naked in the light of truth. Her voice was a rusty croak, dry and fractured. She had to clear her throat to speak, and even then, it came out as a whisper, a sound of disbelief. "No one, sir." Usually, she would address a man as "Master," or "My Lord," out of fear or subservience. But "Sir" came out. Kyrie, a term of respect, yes, but also a recognition of authority. She waited. This was the final gate. The mob had failed, but the law still stood. Moses still spoke from the grave. Adultery was punishable by death. And this man, this rabbi, had not sinned. He had not dropped a stone because of his own guilt. He had dropped no stone at all. He was the only one in the circle who met the criteria he himself had set. Let him who is without sin cast the first stone. Technically, legally, divinely, he could pick up the largest rock at his feet and crush her. And he would be righteous in doing so. The tension returned, sharper this time because hope had begun to bloom, and the death of hope is a far more painful thing than the death of the body. She looked at his hands. They remained open. Jesus looked at her, and in that moment, the transaction of eternity took place. The justice of God, which demanded purity, met the mercy of God, which desired relationship. He did not dismiss her sin. He did not say, "It doesn't matter." He did not say, "You are innocent." She wasn't innocent. She was guilty, but he was about to do something that the law of Moses could never do. The law could only diagnose the disease. It could not cure the patient. A slight smile touched the corners of his lips. Not a smile of amusement, but a smile of victory. A smile that said, "I have won you back. Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus said. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow, but instead of breaking her bones, they shattered her chains. The sentence hung in the air, rewriting her reality. Neither do I. If the judge of the universe does not bang the gavel, then the case is dismissed. If the one who holds the keys to death and Hades steps aside, the prison door is open. She felt a sob rise in her chest, a violent, heaving thing that threatened to collapse her knees again. The relief was so intense it was painful. It was a rush of heat, a flooding of the senses. She wanted to fall at his feet and kiss the dust he had walked on. She wanted to scream. She wanted to weep until she was dry, but he was not finished. He was not just saving her skin, he was saving her soul. He was not just granting a pardon, he was issuing a command. He looked deep into her eyes, holding her gaze, ensuring she heard the condition of this freedom. "Go now," he said, his voice firm, authoritative, a king giving orders to a subject he has just liberated. "And leave your life of sin. Go, sin no more." It wasn't a suggestion, it was an empowerment. In the past, telling her to stop sinning would have been like telling a drowning man to stop swallowing water. She was trapped in the cycle of survival, of using her body to buy bread, to buy protection, to buy a semblance of love. But now, looking at him, she felt something new coursing through her veins. The power that had silenced the mob was now flowing into her. He wasn't just telling her to change. His words were imparting the ability to change. He was giving her a future. He was giving her a blank slate, clear just like the dust on the floor. She nodded. She couldn't speak. Her throat was too tight. She nodded again, more vigorously, tears finally spilling over and tracking through the dust on her face. She scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady but holding. She pulled her torn shawl around her shoulders, covering her exposed skin, not out of shame anymore, but out of a newfound dignity. She took a step back, never taking her eyes off him. She was afraid that if she looked away, he would vanish and the nightmares would return. But he remained there, solid and real, watching her. She turned. The first step was the hardest. Her body expected a hand to grab her ankle. Her ears expected a shout of, "Stop her." But there was only the wind. She took another step, then another. Her pace quickened. She began to walk, then to trot, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. She passed the place where the lead Pharisee had stood. She saw the heavy rock he had dropped. She stepped over it. She passed the entrance to the court of women. She passed the startled guards who had arrived too late to intervene. She burst out of the temple complex and into the streets of Jerusalem. The city was bustling, indifferent to the drama that had just played out within the holy walls. Merchants were hawking spices, donkeys were braying, children were playing in the dirt. The sun was shining. It was a Tuesday. It was an ordinary day. But for the woman running down the steps, gasping for air, clutching her shawl to her chest, the world had been remade. The colors seemed brighter. The air tasted sweeter. She was alive. She was forgiven. The adulteress had died in that circle of stones, and someone new was running toward the lower city, someone who had looked into the face of God and lived. Back in the courtyard, Jesus watched her go until she disappeared into the crowd. He was alone now. The solitude of the temple court felt profound. He looked down at the ground one last time. The names, the sins, the secrets of the religious elite were still faintly visible, though the wind was working hard to erase them. Slowly, Jesus bent down. With the same hand that had healed the leper and calmed the storm, he swept his palm across the dusty pavement. Swish. Swish. In a few broad strokes, he obliterated the record. The names of the Pharisees, their secret sins, the dates, the locations, all of it was wiped away, returned to a chaotic jumble of gray silt. He did not keep a record of wrongs to use against them later. He did not save the evidence for blackmail. He offered them the same mercy he had offered the woman, though they had been too proud to accept it. They had walked away with their guilt intact, hidden once again in the darkness of their hearts. The woman had walked away with her guilt exposed and then removed. That was the difference. He stood up and dusted off his hands. From behind the pillars, shadows began to detach themselves. Tentatively, hesitantly, figures stepped into the light. It was the 12. They had been there, watching from the periphery, hidden in the crowds or behind the great columns of Solomon's porch. They had been terrified when the mob arrived. They had seen the stones. They had feared that this was the end, that their master would be stoned alongside the woman, or arrested by the temple guard. Peter had his hand on the hidden dagger in his belt. John had been chewing his lip until it bled. They had watched the confrontation with bated breath, witnessing the impossible dismantling of the mob. They had seen the power of silence. But they didn't fully understand it. They rarely did. Peter was the first to approach, his face a mixture of relief and bewilderment. He looked at the scattered stones, then at Jesus, then at the empty gate where the woman had fled. "Rabbi," Peter whispered, we thought they had you this time. "The law. How did you?" He trailed off. There were no words for what had just happened. It wasn't a debate, it was a soul surgery. Jesus turned to them. His face was grave, yet serene. The confrontation had taken a toll. One could see the weariness in his shoulders. Dealing with the weight of human sin, absorbing the hatred of a mob, was an exhausting labor. But his work for the day was not done. The crowd, the common people who had scattered when the Pharisees arrived, were beginning to filter back in. They were curious. They saw the rocks. They saw the rabbi standing unharmed. They sensed that they had missed something miraculous, and they wanted to be near the source of that power. Dozens became hundreds. They gathered around, their eyes wide, waiting for him to speak. They wanted a parable. They wanted a healing. They wanted to know what had happened to the woman. But Jesus did not speak of the woman. Her sin was forgiven, and therefore, it was forgotten. He would not turn her trauma into a sermon illustration. Instead, he looked at the sun, which was now climbing high into the sky, flooding the temple courts with a brilliant, exposing illumination. The light that touched everything. The gold of the sanctuary, the white of the marble, the gray of the dust, the hidden corners where shadows tried to flee. He thought of the Pharisees, retreating into the darkness of their secrets. He thought of the woman, running out into the light of a new day. He thought of the world, divided between those who think they see and those who know they are blind. He raised his voice, not in anger, but in proclamation. A voice that carried to the back of the crowd, echoing off the walls that had just witnessed the defeat of legalism. "I am the light of the world," he declared. The crowd went still. It was a massive claim. In the Jewish tradition, light was the symbol of God's presence, the Shekinah glory, the first creation of the Almighty. To claim to be the light was to claim to be the source of truth, of life, of God Himself. "Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness," Jesus continued, his eyes scanning the faces of his disciples, the pilgrims, and the spies who were surely still lurking. "But will have the light of life." The connection was electric. The people looked at the stones on the ground, the instruments of death that belonged to the darkness. And they looked at him, the light that had dispelled that darkness without a weapon. The Pharisees had brought darkness. The darkness of condemnation, the darkness of hidden sin, the darkness of death. Jesus had brought light. The light of exposure that led to repentance, the light of truth that disarmed lies, the light of mercy that gave new life. He walked through the crowd, the disciples trailing in his wake like small boats caught in the current of a great vessel. He moved toward the treasury, past the very spot where the woman had lain. He didn't look down. The dust was just dust again. The miracle wasn't in the writing. The miracle was in the hearts that had been changed. As he walked, the whisperings began. The story was already spreading. Asterisk. Did you hear? The stones. They couldn't throw them. Asterisk. What did he write? Asterisk. Who was the woman? The legend of the day was taking root, destined to be told in whispers in the marketplaces of Jerusalem, and eventually, shouted from the rooftops of history. But for Jesus, it was a step closer to the cross. He knew that by humiliating the leaders of the people so publicly, by stripping them of their moral armor, he had sealed his fate. They would not forgive him for exposing them. The next time they came with stones, or with guards, or with a cross, they would not stop. They would ensure his silence. He knew this. He accepted it, for the sake of the woman, for the sake of the disciples, for the sake of the very men who wanted to kill him. He walked out of the court of women, leaving the stones behind as a silent testimony to the day that mercy triumphed over judgment. And high above, on the pinnacle of the temple, a watching raven took flight, circling the air where the tension had broken, before flying off toward the dark valley of Hinnom, as if carrying the news to the shadows that their grip had slipped, if only for a moment. The sun continued to rise, indifferent and glorious, shining on the just and the unjust alike, but shining brightest on the path of the Nazarene. The sun began its slow descent over the western ridges of Jerusalem, painting the limestone city in hues of bruised purple and burning orange. The heat of the day was breaking, giving way to the cool, dry evening breeze that swept in from the Judean hills. But the cooling air did nothing to soothe the feverish atmosphere that had gripped the holy city. The events of the morning in the court of women had not stayed contained within the temple walls. Like water spilled from a cracked jar, the story had seeped into the marketplaces, the bathhouses, and the dinner tables of the wealthy and the poor alike. Whispers moved faster than the wind. The prophet from Galilee, they said. He defeated the Sanhedrin without lifting a finger. He wrote magic in the dirt. He forgave the unforgivable. In the upper city, in the opulent district where the high priests and the aristocracy resided, the mood was not one of wonder, but of a cold, suffocating dread. Ananias, the elder Pharisee who had held the first stone, the man whose secret sin of 40 years ago had been etched into the dust, sat in his private study. The room was luxurious, adorned with Babylonian tapestries and cedar furniture, illuminated by the flickering light of expensive oil lamps. But Ananias saw none of it. He stared at his own hands. He had scrubbed them. He had used water, hyssop, and rough soap, scrubbing until the skin was raw and red. But he could still feel it. He could feel the phantom weight of the jagged rock he had dropped. And worse, he could feel the dust. It felt as if the dust of the temple floor was permanently under his fingernails, a stain that no ceremonial washing could remove. Miriam. The house of figs. How had he known? Ananias was a man of logic, a man of the law. He believed in cause and effect. If a man broke the Sabbath, he was punished. If a man blasphemed, he was stoned. The world was a structure of rules, and he was one of its architects. But the Nazarene, he was an anomaly. He was a chaos agent. He didn't just break the rules. He seemed to operate by a set of laws that Ananias couldn't comprehend. Laws where a judge could be judged by his own silence, and a guilty criminal could walk free because of a lack of executioners. There was a knock at the door. It was a soft, hesitant rap. "Enter," Ananias croaked. His voice sounded old, brittle. A younger scribe entered, the same one who had stood beside him in the courtyard, the one whose visit to the red door had been exposed. The young man looked haunted. His eyes were darting around the shadows of the room as if he expected the carpenter to step out from behind a curtain. "Rabbi," the young man whispered, closing the door firmly behind him. "We cannot let this stand." Ananias looked up. "What would you have us do? Drag him back? Accuse him again? Did you not see what happened? He flayed us alive, boy. Without a knife. That is exactly why he must be destroyed," the young man hissed, his fear turning into a venomous aggression. He knows everything. Do you think he will stop at writing in the dust? What if next time he shouts it from the portico of Solomon? What if he tells the Roman governor about the funds? Ananias flinched. The funds. The embezzlement from the widow's estates. Yes, Jesus had written that too. The widow's field. He is a seer, Ananias muttered. Or a sorcerer. He traffics with Beelzebub. How else could he know the secrets of men's hearts? It doesn't matter how he knows, the young man pressed, stepping closer to the desk. It matters that he is a threat, not just to our theology, Rabbi, but to our lives. To our station. If the people believe he has the authority to forgive sins, then they do not need the temple. They do not need the sacrifices. They do not need us. The terrifying truth of the statement hung in the air. That was the core of it. The forgiveness Jesus had offered the woman was free. It cost her no dove, no lamb, no shekel of silver. It required no priest to mediate it. It was a direct transaction between the sinner and the Messiah. If that kind of religion took root, the entire edifice of their power would crumble into dust, just like the words written on the floor. Ananias slowly clenched his hand into a fist. The fear was still there, cold and gnawing, but it was being overtaken by a desperate instinct for self-preservation. You are right, Ananias said, his voice gaining a steely edge. He humiliated us today. He showed mercy to a whore despite the law of Moses. He is dangerous. We need a plan, the young man said. Not a public trial. We tried that. We need something darker, something unseen. We need to find a weakness in his circle. One of his followers. Perhaps one who loves money. Ananias nodded slowly. The image of the Nazarene writing in the dust burned in his mind. You wrote my past in the earth, Nazarene, he thought. I will write your future in blood. Go, Ananias commanded. Speak to Caiaphas. Tell him the time for debate is over. The time for the sword has come. While the shadows of conspiracy lengthened in the high city, a different kind of transformation was taking place in the winding alleys of the lower city, in the quarter where the poor and the outcasts lived. Miriam sat on the edge of a low stone wall near a community cistern. The night had fully set in, and the stars were brilliant diamonds scattered across the velvet sky. She was shivering, but not from cold. The adrenaline of her escape had faded, leaving her exhausted, drained, and strangely light. She had washed her face. She had scrubbed away the tear tracks and the dirt of the temple floor. She had pinned her hair up, covering it modestly with her shawl. She looked, to any passerby, like a normal woman. But she felt like a stranger in her own body. For years, she had carried a heaviness in her chest, a knot of shame, anger, and self-loathing that never went away. It was there when she woke up. It was there when she sold herself. It was there when she slept. It was the defining gravity of her existence. But now, it was gone. She pressed her hand to her chest, feeling the steady rhythm of her heart. The knot was untied. The silence inside her was not empty, it was peaceful. Neither do I condemn you. The voice replayed in her mind, over and over, more beautiful than any song of David. It wasn't just that she hadn't died. It was that she had been seen. He hadn't looked at her body, he had looked at her. And in that looking, he had washed her clean. A group of children ran past her, chasing a stray dog, their laughter echoing off the stone walls. Usually, Miriam would shrink away, afraid that their mothers would see her and shout at the children to stay away from the unclean woman. But tonight, she watched them with a soft smile. Miriam? She started, turning her head. An older woman, a neighbor who had not spoken to her in 5 years, was standing there holding a water jar. The woman looked hesitant, her eyes searching Miriam's face. I heard, the neighbor whispered. Is it true? The rabbi? Did he really stop them? Miriam stood up. She felt a new strength in her legs. She didn't look down at her feet in shame. She looked the neighbor in the eye. He didn't just stop them, Miriam said, her voice steady and clear. He saved them, and he saved me. The neighbor stared at her. There was something different about Miriam's face. The hardness was gone. The desperation was gone. There was a glow, a reflection of the light she had encountered in the courtyard. I am going to my father's house in Bethany, Miriam said, making a decision she hadn't known she was capable of until that moment. I haven't seen him since I left. I don't know if he will take me back. But I have to try. I am new. The neighbor hesitated, then reached out a hand and gently touched Miriam's arm. It was the first time in years someone had touched her without trying to take something from her. "Go in peace, Miriam," the woman said softly. Miriam nodded, tears pricking her eyes again, not tears of terror, but of gratitude. She turned and began the long walk toward the city gates. She was walking into the unknown, with no money, no reputation, and an uncertain future. But she walked with the stride of a free woman. She was no longer a captive of her past. Her history had been written in the dust, and the wind had blown it away. Far outside the city walls, on the slopes of the Mount of Olives, the air was cool and smelled of wild thyme and olive wood. Jesus sat on a large rock, overlooking the sleeping city. The Temple Mount was a dark silhouette against the starry sky, a massive, imposing structure that housed the presence of God, yet had become a fortress for men who did not know him. The disciples were gathered around a small fire nearby, roasting grain and speaking in hushed tones. They were still buzzing with the energy of the day, recounting the events, arguing about the details. But John, the youngest, sat a little apart, closer to Jesus. He was watching his master. Jesus seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the lights of Jerusalem. He looked weary. The confrontation with the darkness was not without cost. Virtue had gone out of him. "Rabbi?" John asked softly. Jesus turned, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight. "Yes, John?" "The writing," John ventured, the question that had been burning in all their minds. "Why in the dust? You have spoken words that will last forever. You have carved commandments on stone in the days of old. Why write today in the dust that blows away?" Jesus smiled, a sad, knowing smile. He reached down and picked up a handful of the dry earth from the Mount of Olives. He let it sift through his fingers, the grains falling back to the ground. "John," Jesus said quietly, "what is man made of?" John frowned, thinking back to the Torah. "Dust, Lord, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground." "Yes," Jesus nodded, "dust. You are dust, and to dust you shall return." The law of Moses was written on stone, cold, hard, unchanging, and unforgiving. Stone crushes, stone remains. But the hearts of these men, they are not stone, though they try to make them so. They are dust, fragile, blown by the wind of their passions. He looked back at the city. "I wrote their sins in the dust because that is what they are. Temporary. If they had repented, their sins would have been washed away as easily as a hand wiping a floor. I wrote in the dust to show them that I did not come to carve their condemnation into eternity. I came to write a new covenant." He brushed his hands together, cleaning them of the dirt. "And there is another reason," Jesus added, his voice dropping to a whisper that only John could hear. "The prophet Jeremiah once said, 'O Lord, the hope of Israel, all who forsake you shall be ashamed. Those who depart from me shall be written in the earth, because they have forsaken the Lord, the fountain of living waters.'" John's eyes widened. "The prophecy. They claim to know the prophets," Jesus said. "So I gave them a sign from the prophets. They have forsaken the living water. They chose the dry earth. So in the earth, their names were written." Jesus stood up, the movement fluid and strong. He looked at the gathered disciples, the 12 men who would carry this story to the ends of the earth. "But do not marvel at the dust, John," Jesus said, placing a hand on the young man's shoulder. "Marvel that the dust can breathe. Marvel that the dust can change. Today, a daughter of Eve, formed from dust, was given the breath of life again. That is why we are here. Lord," Peter called out from the fire, "will they come back?" "The Pharisees?" Jesus looked into the darkness, toward the direction of the high priest's palace. He felt the shifting of the spiritual tides. He felt the anger of the enemy, the bruising of the serpent's head, and the gathering venom for the strike that was to come. "They will come," Jesus said simply. "But not with stones next time. Next time, they will come with wood and nails." The disciples fell silent. They didn't understand. They didn't want to understand. They were still riding the high of victory. They couldn't see the shadow of the cross looming on the horizon. "But fear not," Jesus said, his voice ringing with the same authority that had silenced the mob. "For the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." He turned away from the city, leading them further up the mountain, into the quiet refuge of the garden called Gethsemane. Back in the temple, the night watchmen were making their rounds. The court of women was silent and empty. The moonlight cast long, ghostly shadows across the pavement. A young Levite guard, bored with his shift, walked through the center of the courtyard. He carried a torch, the flame flickering in the breeze. He looked down at the floor, where the commotion had been that morning. He had heard the rumors. He was curious. He lowered his torch, squinting at the limestone flags. He was looking for magic words. He was looking for curses or blessings carved into the rock, but there was nothing. The wind had done its work. The feet of hundreds of pilgrims had passed over the spot during the afternoon. The dust was smooth. The names, Miriam, Ananiah, the widow, the thief, were all gone. The record was erased. The guard shrugged, disappointed. Just stories, he muttered to himself. Nothing but dust. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the vast emptiness, but he was wrong. It was not just stories. And it was not just dust. The event had been etched into a record far more permanent than stone. It was written in the book of life. It was written in the transformed heart of a woman walking toward Bethany. It was written in the terrified conscience of an old man in the upper city. And it was written in the fabric of history, a testimony that would echo for 2,000 years and beyond. The dust had settled, but the light remained. And in the unseen realm, in the heavy spiritual atmosphere that hung over Jerusalem, the forces of darkness trembled. They had played their best card, accusation, and it had been trumped by mercy. They had tried to use the law to kill the lawgiver, and they had failed. They knew, with a terrifying certainty, that their time was short. The man who wrote in the dust was not just a teacher. He was the finger of God, come to rewrite the world. As the night deepened, the wind picked up again, swirling the loose earth of the courtyard, carrying it up over the walls, over the city, and out into the wide, waiting world. The dust of Jerusalem, bearing the invisible memory of grace, was scattered to the four winds, a foreshadowing of the gospel that would soon cover the earth as the waters cover the sea.